let's get started right now. It's 10 o'clock. Okay. So I walked through this process, an entire. Everybody. So we've watched through this entire process of what it looks like in terms of serving God. We spoke about the concepts of Yira and Ava, awe of God, and the original levels of service of God, where a person is doing what they need to do and they put their own desires aside. Then we said there's a second level in which a person is invested themselves. They push, and there's Ava, there's love of God, and it's coming from themselves, and there's this effort to be able to turn over their animal soul into godliness and interact with the world in such a way that that the world is impacted. And then we said that there are issues that people suffer from, the issues of a total and absolute lack of inspiration or motivation at all. So on the very basic level of that, we said, is the concept of barrenness, in which there is no receptacle, so to speak. There's no way for the person to be able to even accept any inspiration, because the person is so full of their own self, they're so self-focused that they have no room for anything else. There's no space to be able to allow anything else inside. So we said that's the first level of barrenness. Then the second level of barrenness is in which we allow ourselves to be inspired, to be intellectually moved, but we don't develop those feelings anywhere, and they just die off. They just dissipate. They don't come to any practical outlet. They don't come to any emotional outlet. And so therefore there might be intellectual inspiration, but there's no emotional movement. There's no drive forward besides for the fact, oh, that was interesting. That was really cool. And we said, in order to be able to negate those kinds of spiritual disease, what we need to do is to recognize that we need to put ourselves aside. So this is back to the first level of service, really. But beyond that, we need to get to a certain place where every single year, at least once a year, around Rosh Hashanah, around Yom Kippur, or it could happen at the rest of the year, but the point of the matter is that at least once a year, we have a quantum shift in how we view our relationship with God. And we allow ourselves to completely warp ourselves to a different, to a different level, move ourselves to a totally different space. And that's how we can avoid those levels of disease. But now we need to understand what the idea of bereavement is. What's the idea of loss? And that's what we're up to in chapter 9. And so the Rebbe says here, there is therefore one more element of the conversation that every person must consider within themselves. And here, like as before where we described, we went from one level to the next with regards to a person's desires. That you could have somebody who desires things which are forbidden. You could have somebody who desires things which are permissible, but basically allow a person to be wrapped up in it in such a way that they lose sight or they're disconnecting from the divine as a result of it. Then we said there's even spiritual desires as such as they are. So the same way we built that up to show that this is not just something that's applicable to somebody who's quote unquote not so observant, or somebody who's quote unquote not so holy or anything like that. We're going to see here as well that there's likewise the ideas that we're expressing here are applicable to people on the highest of spiritual levels. So the things that we're going to describe, the person that the Rebbe describes over here is not something that I can even pretend that I know anything about it. In other words, because this person that we're going to describe here is somebody who is truly a spiritual master. And even such a person, the Rebbe says, such a person needs to be aware. They need to be aware that they can fail. And that's what we're going to see here. So chapter 9, there's therefore one more element of this conversation that every person must consider within themselves. Even someone whose intellectual comprehension and revealed emotional state are aligned spiritually, meaning that the love and fear of God that he feels are not imaginary, but true. And they express themselves in his practical study of Torah and fulfillment of mitzvot. And when we talk about imaginary and true, I think that's a very important point, because there are people who think that they're spiritual, and really they've just created this false picture of what spiritual is. And in reality, what they're just doing is they're making themselves feel good. I remember once I was talking to somebody many, many years ago, and he made the comment that he used to go to Fish concerts, and he said that they were very spiritual. As you know, and at the time, I was a very young rabbi, and I was like, "But how could a Fish concert be spiritual?" Well, I'm sure those of you who have been at such concerts, you know that it very, very well can be spiritual, but negatively spiritual. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. And the question is how the person, what the energies are, and where they're driven towards. That's a question of whether or not the spirituality is something that is good or if it's not. And there's plenty of evidence that there is spirituality outside of Judaism, but not necessarily is it aligned with godliness. And that's a very, very important thing. So some people basically create a Judaism inside their head, or they create a connection with God inside their head, or spirituality inside their head, which is not necessarily true, is not aligned with Judaism. And there are different ways that that can express itself. You, of course, have some people who pretend, they pretend to be spiritual and they're not, they do that by kind of acting the part. You have other people who create false worlds, and they can do that through music, and they can do that through meditations and all that kind of thing. But what we're talking about here is something that is intensely personal, and it's true. And therefore it's aligned with Judaism, and it's aligned with Jewish texts, and it's aligned with the process of mysticism and spirituality that Judaism talks about. So it's not pretend stuff. It's not using incenses and chants from the Far East. It's something that is within one's own mind and heart. So such a person has completely pulled all the pieces together. So the Rebbe continues and says, such a person may not only study Torah and fulfill mitzvot, but even doing so, knowing the inner intent behind the mitzvot. And he explains, he may even know all the spiritual extensions of the mitzvot. In other words, that through his fulfillment of the mitzvah of tzedakah, he elicits the aspect of chesed. And through those that deal with judgment, he elicits the aspect of gvura. And through his Torah study, he draws on the attribute of tiferet. So such a person, when he does a mitzvah, he's not just putting on tefillin, but he's going through this spiritual, intense experience in which he is trying to draw on. He's trying to pull down these energies. What does this look like? I don't know. Robert, go ahead.
Thank you. When I've studied this and in conversations, people always bring up the statement or argument, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And so the question is, you're smiling, so talk about that, okay?
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very important thing. Spirituality itself is a feeling. And the question is that just a feeling that's making yourself feel good? And when we talk about religious, we're going to talk about, specifically, how do we align ourselves within what God wants us to do? And that's the difference. So somebody can be absolutely spiritual, and they might even have very, very special experiences. But that's not godly spirituality. Godly spirituality is specifically within the framework of what God tells us to do. And like we said before, this is very much based on where the person is, their ability to be able to study, their ability to be able to, what they've learned in their lives and all that kind of thing. So you can't just say, okay, well, if you haven't studied anything, therefore you're not spiritual. That's not true. And I'll give you an example. It's one of my favorite little stories of pre-Rosh Hashanah, pre-Yom Kippur stories of this guy who, Rebbe, not one of the Chabad Rebbes, I don't remember who it was, but he said to his students, he says, come, let's go see how a pure and sincere Jew does teshuvah. So they go off to the edge of the town, and there's the tailor. And the tailor is not known to be a particularly religious guy. And they peek into his window. He doesn't have a family, and he's got 2 cups of vodka on the table. And they see him pick one up, raise it in the air, knock it back, and then they see him knock the other one back. And the Rebbe kind of laughs and says, come, let's go. So now everybody there thinks, okay, this guy must be one of the hidden tzaddikim, one of the hidden righteous men of the world. And they come over to him with tremendous respect and say, please tell us what was going on. Were there angels flying? Was there, basically what was going on in your house? And the guy looks at them like they fell off the moon. And they say, well, at least tell us what happened. We saw you pick up 2 glasses and we saw you say something. And that was it. He goes, okay, you want to know what happened? I'll tell you what happened. He said, this past year was a rough year for me. I lost an account at the beginning of the year, and I was very upset at God. And I said, okay, God, if you mess with my account, with my financials, I'm going to pay you back. And so he says, I stopped putting on tefillin every day. I did it sometimes, but I didn't do it all the time. And then, things got a little bit worse, and he lost another account, and another, somebody else basically stiffed him some money from something else. And he just goes through this process of like, okay, God, all right, you do that to me, I'm going to hit you back. I'm going to, stop keeping Shabbat properly and all that kind of thing. So it's gotten to this point where I'm really not doing financially very well. And I figure, it's time to have a heart-to-heart with God. And what do 2 friends do when they need to have a heart-to-heart? They pour themselves a cup of hard A, and they sit down over the 2 and they air their problems. And so that's exactly what I did. I sat down, I poured 2 cups of vodka. I said, okay, God, listen, I know this year's been rough between the 2 of us, but you started it, but I'm willing to forgive if you're willing to forgive me. Now, he says, what do 2 Jews do when they make up? They drink l'chaim. So I drank l'chaim to God. Now, obviously, God's not going to drink his vodka, so I drank his cup as well. And that was what happened. So that was something that was actually, he may not have even realized that was something intensely spiritual. His lack of knowledge and his lack of alignment with the full ideals and whatever it is of Judaism doesn't change the fact that the Rebbe in that story recognized that what was going on was a truly spiritual and divine moment, because it was this alignment, this pure and sincere, no garbage alignment with what needs to be done. And so that is true spirituality. And that's really where it's at. And so that's really what I would say is the difference between spirituality that we do to make ourselves feel good, as opposed to spirituality that is truly divine because it's connecting us with God. Did that answer the question?
Oh yeah, no, I understand. Again, it's always out there and always questioners about the whole thing. Yeah, no, of course. Thank you.
That's exactly it. The neurologists have found certain areas in the brain that react spiritually and that kind of thing. And so therefore they try to make, the human being into a robot and say, okay, well, this particular part of the brain is stimulated. And so therefore you felt spiritual. Well, that's true, but that's only true of the very, very limiting element of spirituality, as opposed to what we're doing here is specifically trying to get closer to the infinite. And that's done by letting go of ourselves, and not by making ourselves feel good. And sometimes it does make ourselves, we feel good as a result, but that's not the focus. That's absolutely not the focus. So such a person knows the Torah and mitzvot in such a way that when they do the mitzvot, they're tapping into the spiritual energies behind the mitzvot, and they recognize them. They know them intellectually, and they're feeling them in their heart. And there are expressions of these things being felt and thought about, and there are energies that they're totally full of. And the Rebbe continues and says, his service may even be on the manner that perfectly matches the words, and you shall serve God your God. That Havaya, the Tetragrammaton, Yud Ke Vav Ke, the name of God, was, is, and will be in a single unit. In other words, that is your God. That beyond nature, completely beyond the limitations of what we have. And it says even higher than that. Havaya is, it is beyond Ishtalshlos, beyond the chain of energy. So now we're talking about somebody who is not just deeply spiritual and not just is capable of these things, but is truly divine, a really truly divine, a righteous person in every single way possible. Such a person that he's able to draw on the name Yud Ke Vav Ke, and that name Yud Ke Vav Ke becomes your God. In other words, meaning your energy and vitality. He lives off of the divine. That's what he is. Such a person. Now, these are things that, again, they're completely beyond our capacity of understanding them. But even such a person needs to be aware. And that's what the Rebbe continues and says, even a person on such a lofty spiritual level must guard against becoming satisfied with the state of his divine service. Because once he does so, he will become stagnant and no longer go further and higher. This is because in addition to the fact that self-satisfaction can kill off the love and awe that he already created, which is bereavement, in addition, even when he is serving God on that lofty level, his service remains limited in accordance with whatever means is driven by his own enjoyment. So this is just mind-blowing in terms of the expectations that the Rebbe is setting forth here. He's saying, look, if at the highest of spiritual levels, if you get to a point where you are just satisfied with where you are and you kick back, so at that point, two things. You kill off the energies that you already have because now you're focused on yourself and you're not focused on God, number one. But number two, your divine service, such as it is going to be only enveloped in yourself. And the idea is transcendence. Transcendence is to get outside of yourself. And so therefore, the only way to be able to transcend is to let go of yourself. Is to let go of your particular feelings and energies and desires and all that kind of thing. And so the Rebbe points out this is hinted to in the words "in your land" found towards the end of the title verse. Its root comes from the word ratzon, meaning desire. This means to say that the truest level of divine service is one that negates your own desires, both the simplest of desires as referred to in the term barren woman as explained earlier, as well as the feeling of self-satisfaction. One of the most remarkable things my father told me about watching the Rebbe when the Rebbe would speak, I was a kid, so I don't remember it quite as vividly, is that the Rebbe would speak for hours and hours and hours, and he would never, or I shouldn't say never, rarely sit back. His back would rarely touch the back of his chair. And it's physically, it's remarkable because if you're speaking for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, especially as a 75, 80, 85-year-old man, obviously that's quite physically remarkable. But when you watch the Rebbe speak, you see this element of drivenness. And on the occasion that he kicks back, it was so surprising that Chassidim would actually write it down in their diaries and say, oh, today the Rebbe actually sat back for some kind of reason. And they would talk about it, for whatever reasons that it actually happened. But there's this idea that as soon as a person starts basically patting themselves on the back, you're really in essence, you're losing flow of the entire purpose of the entire the momentum, the drive, and everything else. We can imagine as if you're talking about a pitcher who's gotten through 7 innings, perfect game. He says, I'm already basically wrapped this all up. So basically, I don't need to put the same energy into it because of the fact that I've already gotten through 7 innings, and I'm wiping these guys out. What's going to happen? He's going to make a mistake. He's absolutely going to make a mistake. And, those of us who are baseball fans, we all know about the occasions in which a person has, even the greatest of pitchers, Pedro Martinez, I believe, got 1 pitch away from a perfect game. And that kind of thing happens because perfection is something that needs to be constantly pushed. And the second that a person lets up, well, everything that's the momentum that's been built has, completely dissipates. But that's incredibly difficult. So the question that the Rebbe asks is, how do we avoid that? And this is chapter 10. And this is a remarkable chapter. I think I told you at the beginning of describing the history here, is that when the Rebbe was concept, avoiding self-satisfaction, being constantly motivated, during this part of the section, he burst into tears. And he was crying to the point where he couldn't continue speaking for several minutes. He's just head down on the table and just sobbing. And at the time, again, this is back in 1952, I believe it was just the energies were so raw and so obvious that people spoke about it at the time, spoke about it for years afterwards. And we're going to see inside, even in the translation, I tried to keep to that, the passion that you pick up from the Rebbe, the energy that the Rebbe was saying, this crying out of the drive to be completely and truly connected. So how do we avoid that? So the verse answers this by saying, I will fill the days of your life. So if you look back at the beginning of the verse, it says, you shall serve God your God. And then it says, there will be no barren woman or bereaved woman in your land. And we explained that barrenness, we explained the idea of bereaved, and we explained the idea of in your land means as a result of your desires. Now we're going to continue with the next section of the verse. I will fill the days of your life. The Rebbe's brilliant treating of this verse now gives you that this concept of I will fill the days of your life answers the question, how do we accomplish this type of service? He says this is the antidote to self-satisfaction. Simply put, a person must consider that he was given an exact number of days to his life, no more and no less. Every day, every hour, and every moment one must be working to fulfill his mission in this world. When he does so, he becomes so focused to the point that he simply has no time whatsoever to start thinking about what particular spiritual level he's on or he's aiming at. So the whole idea of giving myself a status, giving myself a particular definition, a particular rank, so to speak, spiritually, those things simply don't exist anymore. Because there's one thing that he knows he needs to focus on, and that one thing is, what do I need to do? And we see this exhibited in the classic Talmudic story of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So who was Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai? He was the sage that was present at the destruction of the temple. He was able to escape Jerusalem just before it was ransacked. He went to Vespasian, who was the Roman general, and Vespasian said, okay, what do you want? He says, give me Yavne v'chachameh, give me the rabbis, give me the sages. And the Vespasian's attitude was like, okay, you want the spiritual, he had no idea that he was saving the Jewish people by saying that I'm going to spare the lives of the spiritual leadership. He had no idea. But Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was the person who is the catalyst to help save post-temple Judaism. I hate the term rabbinic Judaism because the concept is ridiculous for many reasons. But for the purposes here, when we talk about the entire process of having a Judaism without the temple, that was created by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who realized that this major tragedy in Jewish life could fracture and destroy the Jewish people. So he and the rabbis worked on creating a system in which Judaism would be able to maintain itself. And, if I say so myself, it's done a remarkably good job. We've done it in 2,000 years ever since, and we're still plugging away. So he was a remarkable figure. One of the most important figures in Judaism historically, without question. Now, on his deathbed, continue inside, he was found by his students to be crying. When they asked him why, he responded, "I don't know which direction that they'll be taking me. And they might be taking me to heaven, they might be taking to hell." And you're like, okay, wait a second. Here's a man who single-handedly saved Judaism. He's not pretending. He's not faking anything. Why is he thinking about such things? And, basically he's not, he knows what he's accomplished. And so the Rebbe gives an explanation here. And he says, one of the explanations given for this shocking statement is that Rabban Yochanan was so utterly consumed with fulfilling his life's mission that he had no time at all to consider exactly what his spiritual level was. He was so pressured, and overwhelmed by the task of fulfilling his mission every day and at every moment that he was simply not able to map out his intellectual and emotional spiritual state, certainly not to explore his soul's deepest and most concealed capacities. The approach is basically, I have no time to focus on myself. I need to focus on my people. And the devotion, the utter devotion to the role that he was given by God got to the point where now he's about to die. Suddenly he's like, okay, did I accomplish what I needed to for myself? Was I able to truly fill my life with godliness? Did I use out my own spiritual? Now is the first time he's able to think about it in years, because of the fact that until this point, and I use these words, pressed, pressured, and overwhelmed. Those are three Yiddish words that the Rebbe used to describe it, and you can kind of feel the feeling of this new Rebbe, so to speak, in the same position 5 years after the Holocaust. So when one applies this attitude, knowing that he must fulfill his divinely given mission at every moment, he most certainly will not be trapped by self-congratulatory feelings of self-satisfaction. And even if one moment passes that he is not working in his divine service, he'll recognize that it's not just a moment that passed in which he could have advanced and flourished in his service and did not do so, is that during this vacuous moment, he rebelled against the King of Kings by the fact that he was not accomplishing the mission that he was tasked with. And here's where the Rebbe just burst into tears. And like I said, I mean, I feel it every single time. I've studied this discourse. I don't know how many times, maybe 24 times. And just the feeling is that the Rebbe's tears are wet on the page. The drive is absolutely incredible. The responsibility is just unbelievable. So given such an attitude, the possibility of self-satisfaction is absurd. When you ask him, what is the status of your ba'artzecha? In other words, basically, okay, where's your spiritual state? Where are you holding? He will cry out bitterly in response, who me, ratzon or tainug? Ratzon meaning the desire to God, tainug meaning the spiritual pleasures. Who me, yira or ava? Me be focused on my exact divine state of my awe of God or my love of God. How can he possibly think about exalted spiritual states when he must stand constantly on guard to ensure that even a moment does not go by in rebellion, God forbid, by the lack of mission fulfillment? It's a mind-blowing insight into the Rebbe's head. It's a mind-blowing insight into the motivation that the Rebbe gave his Chassidim. You know, I was working with the founder of Starbucks, and I was trying to motivate him to be a little bit more involved. And I gave him this essay, and I don't think he read it because, you know, he wouldn't have understood it. I said, I want to study this with you. But the reason why I gave him this essay to study was because I wanted him to understand. He kept on asking me, it's like, okay, why does Chabad not have a new leader? Like, you don't understand the motivation that the Rebbe implanted into us. With this kind of motivation, how can you not, how can you just kick back? How can you read this and just and stay stagnant and say, okay, I'm not going to do something. That energy is something that lives and it leaps off the pages, especially when you look at the Rebbe's life, and that the Rebbe was not just saying these things conceptually. Excuse me. But the fact is that the Rebbe lived this idea, these ideals himself, and that was something that was clearly documented by the hours that he kept in terms of the amount of work that he had to. He would go home at 2 or 3 in the morning, and he would take work home with him, and he'd be back in the office at 8 o'clock in the morning. These things are very, very clear historical record, because people were watching every move.
Rabbi, could you explain that the Rebbe is not crying from depression? It's not that the Rebbe is depressed and that we should be depressed. It's a different kind of crying.
Yes, these tears are tears of absolute drivenness. There are 2 different emotions that are discussed in Chassidic literature. You have the emotion of depression, which is absolutely negated, and it's a completely negative emotion. And then you have bitterness, which is a driving force. I don't want to be in this state, or I want to accomplish these things, and I'm limited. And that bitterness is not basically saying, woe is to me. It's saying, I want, and I'm going to move towards that. And that's, without question, those are the feelings that are being driven here.
But bitterness is the evil inclination we always have to fight against and not accept.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. And we have to constantly push ourselves towards this. Chapter 11 and 12 are going to continue with an incredible reflection on these same words to fill the days of our lives. The Rebbe says that that's also a promise. That's not only an instruction, that's also a promise. And that's going to be a beautiful, beautiful kind of finale of this essay. And God willing, we will discuss it next week on Wednesday.
Rabbi, I just want to say, I think that there's a misunderstanding, like what Robert said. It's the bitterness is not a bad thing. It's the depression. It's the bad thing. The bitterness is the thing that drives a person to do something. The depression, merirus, is a good thing. It's atzvus, which is the bad thing, because the atzvus makes a person not want to do anything. Merirus, the bitterness, drives a person to want to do stuff. So it's not the bitterness that's bad. It's the depression that's the bad thing.
Pardon me, I misunderstood. I thought he was saying that the Yetzer Hara is that which is holding us back and wants to get us into that space of self-satisfaction. It's the bitterness that allows us to escape from that. That's what I thought he was saying. But so you're absolutely correct. Thank you for pulling that up.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. We'll see you next week.
Drive safely.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good.